Hello, and welcome back to the History of the Mongols. I'm your host, Kyle. On the wide, dusty floodplain outside Baghdad, an army of roughly 100,000, accompanied by many times that number in horses and pack animals, rings the city like an iron band. Stone shot from great trebuchets arc ceaselessly into the walls, the missiles hauled from far afield and fed into engines that do not sleep. Here a tower buckles under the barrage. Their assault ladders bite into parapets as contingents of Mongols and subject troops struggle hand to hand with a panicked garrison. Arrows fall like sleet, some tipped with messages meant to terrify as much as wound. The Tigris, the city's lifeblood, has become part of the trap. Pontoon bridges anchor the river north and south of Baghdad, nets studded with iron hooks trailing from them to snare anyone who tries to slip past in the current. In the palace, the last Abbasid Caliph sits overwhelmed as Hülegü Khan's grip tightens. Today we turn to the fall of Baghdad in 1258. And if you're enjoying the series, consider subscribing and leaving a like or comment. It helps more listeners find these episodes. When we last left off, Hülegü had dismantled the Nizari Ismaili state, better known in Western sources as the so-called Order of Assassins, which controlled a chain of fortresses across eastern and northern Iran. By the end of 1256, they were reduced to a few isolated holdouts, and Hülegü could look to his next objective. Among contemporary observers, none was more enthusiastic than the Persian administrator and historian Juvain, who travelled with Hülegü. Casting the campaign as divinely sanctioned, Juvain styled Hülegü as a sword of Islam, executing God's will against heresy. He even framed the conquest as a more civilized alternative to Genghis Khan's annihilating war against the Khwarezmians 3 decades earlier. Destruction, he argued, was confined to Ismaili lands and to towns that refused to submit, rather than sweeping across entire provinces. What Hülegü would soon do in Baghdad, and to the titular head of Sunni Islam, could not be praised in the same register, and it is telling that Juvain's chronicle effectively concludes with the fall of the Ismailis. As Hülegü exited Ismaili territory in the final weeks of 1256, his attention fixed on the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. To understand why Baghdad mattered, we need the institutional backdrop. In Islam, supreme religious authority devolved from the Prophet Muhammad to his successors. For Shia Muslims, that authority lay with the Imam. For the Nizari Ismailis, the Imam, until recently executed on Mongol orders, had ruled from Alamut. For the Sunni majority, leadership resided in the Caliph, literally the successor. The first 4 caliphs after the Prophet, remembered as the rightly guided, al-Rashidun, hold near universal legitimacy in Islamic memory. The caliphate then passed to the Umayyads, who propelled Muslim rule from the Atlantic littoral, across North Africa, and Iberia to the oases and steppes of Transoxiana. In 750, the Abbasid revolution toppled the Umayyads. Claiming descent from the Prophet's uncle, Al-Abbas, the new dynasty shifted the capital from Damascus to a purpose-built seat on the Tigris, Baghdad. The early Abbasids presided over a vast commonwealth, but from the 9th century onward, centrifugal forces gnawed at their power. Fatimids in Egypt, Samanids, Buyids, and Safarids in Iran, and, crucially, the great Seljuks from the steppe pressed in, until by the later 11th century, the caliph's effective domain often scarcely extended beyond Baghdad's walls. The sudden death of the Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah in 1092 fractured Seljuk authority and allowed the Abbasids to claw back some independence. In 1157, they even repelled a Seljuk assault on Baghdad. The long reigns of al-Nasir, 1180 to 1225, and al-Mustansir, 1226 to 1242, restored Abbasid control over much of central and southern Iraq. Though a shadow of the imperial reach of the 8th century, the caliphs still carried enormous symbolic weight in the 13th. For 5 centuries they had been acknowledged as heads of the Sunni world and cultivated an aura of inviolability and sanctity, officially above temporal affairs, even as they were continually entangled in them. In the late 12th century, Caliph al-Nasir was embroiled in a grinding struggle with the Seljuks, who still dominated much of Iran. Looking for leverage, he aligned with the rising Khwarezmian state to the northeast. Once loyal vassals of the great Seljuks, The Khwarazm Shahs had become their rivals as they pushed south. Tekesh bi-il-Arslan, the reigning Khwarazm Shah, gladly accepted the alliance. In 1294, at Rai, modern Tehran, Tekesh crushed and killed the last Seljuk Sultan in Iran, Togrul III, and sent the severed head to Baghdad as a message of friendship and power. The gesture did not mean freedom for the Abbasid Caliphate. Tekesh simply stepped into the Seljuk's shoes. He annexed the old Seljuk territories in Iran and soon began pressing claims and making demands of the Caliph himself. Al-Nasir countered by encouraging the Seljuk's eastern enemies, the Ghurids, to keep Khwarazm occupied. Tekesh died in 1200 and was succeeded by his son, Muhammad II, who, through a mix of luck, timely assassinations and military victories, broke the Ghurids, consolidated Iran, and in 1217 even tried to march on Baghdad. That attempt ended in humiliation. A brutal snowstorm in the Zagros forced Muhammad's army to turn back. He returned to the northeast of his realm, and there made the disastrous choices that would provoke the Mongol invasion of Khwarazm, events we covered back in previous episodes. Some writers at the time claimed that al-Nasir actively invited Genghis Khan to attack Muhammad of Khwarazm. Given the Caliph's habit of backing the enemy of his enemy, whichever power sat east of his current rival, there is a certain logic to the accusation. But as we laid out in episode 8, the immediate cause of the Mongol onslaught rests squarely with Muhammad II's own misconduct. Had the Caliph truly solicited Mongol aid, we should expect the Mongols to have trumpeted the invitation to justify their war and to sow chaos among Khwarazmian subjects. They did not. When detachments from Jebeh and Subu'tai's army probed into northern Iraq in 1221, al-Nasir did not greet them as allies. Instead, he coordinated a short-lived defensive coalition with the rulers of the region's key cities, Muzaffar al-Din of Irbil and Badr al-Din Lulul, the de facto master of Mosul. The alliance proved unnecessary. The Mongols soon withdrew. In the meantime, the Abbasid court spun tales of an immense, heaven-favoured army, hoping to deter any renewed incursion. A close observer might have called the bluff in the years that followed. In 1225, that notorious Khwarazmian survivor, Jalal al-Din Mingburnu, defeated a caliphal force after the Abbasids failed to give him promised support. He chased the routed troops to the very suburbs of Baghdad, then wheeled north, smashed an Irbil army sent to aid the Caliph, and captured Muzaffar al-Din himself. By then al-Nasir was elderly, paralysed and reportedly blind for 3 years. He died soon after Jalal al-Din's campaign. His son al-Zahir succeeded as the 35th Caliph, only to reign for 9 months. On al-Zahir's death in 1226, his own son, al-Mustansir, took the throne as the 36th and penultimate Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad. As Caliph, al-Mustansir tried to reassert Abbasid authority in Iraq and expand the army, but Mongol power continued to press in on every side. By the early 1230s, Chormakhan Noyan and his lieutenants had secured most of Iran and extended Mongol control across the Caucasus. From Baghdad, the empire to the north and east looked like an immense crescent stretching to the horizon. By 1235, forces under Chagatai Noyan, known as the Lesser, were probing into northern Iraq, testing Abbasid strength without yet committing to a full campaign. In June 1237, they seized Irbil in today's Iraqi Kurdistan, though the citadel held out until a caliphal relief force arrived in August. In February 1238, a Mongol strike pushed toward Baghdad itself. A rattled al-Mustansir appealed to the remaining independent Muslim rulers from the Jazeera and Syria down to Egypt for help. Only about 2,000 men from the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, al-Kamil, made it to the city, and in June a caliphal field army was defeated on Baghdad's outskirts. Even so, the capital's fortifications were formidable, and the attackers were unprepared for a protracted investment, or for the Iraqi summer. The Mongols pulled back from the walls. Persian historian Wasaf, writing some 60 years later, even claimed they suffered a reverse under Baghdad's ramparts, though no other near-contemporary source corroborates the story. Baghdad remained independent, but the Mongols kept dismantling the political landscape around it. Chormakhan's successor Baiju broke the Seljuks of Rum at Kosedar in 1243, and in 1244 the commander Yasa'ur rode into Syria, driving out the last Khwarazmian freebooters who had lingered there since Jalal al-Din's fall. The Ayyubids of Syria largely submitted in 1244–45, and even the Principality of Antioch, one of the last Crusader polities, offered its obedience. Another probe toward Baghdad followed in late 1245 but was soon abandoned. The new Caliph, al-Mustasim ibn al-Mustansir, on the throne since 1242, was fortunate that the attack fizzled. By then he was running out of allies. He seems to have bought time with token accommodation. The Franciscan John of Plano Carpini, present at the enthronement of Hülegü Khan in 1246, noted the presence of Abbasid envoys at Karakorum and believed the Caliphate was paying a regular tribute. Al-Mustasim, the 38th and last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, did not measure up to his father or great-grandfather. Where al-Nasir and al-Mustansir had laboured to rebuild caliphal power, al-Mustasim cultivated comfort. Contemporary voices, and most later ones, condemned him as decadent and indecisive. He loved music. He even sponsored a quarter of Baghdad for musicians, including the celebrated Saif al-Din Urmawa, and took pleasure in pigeon racing, fine calligraphy, and curious treasures. Politically, he wavered and let factions steer him. Some courtiers, including the vizier, urged accommodation with the Mongols. Others demanded defiance. The result was a lurching policy that alternated between provocations and gift-sending. Essentially, the worst sort of man to have in power when Hülegü marched on him with upwards of 100,000 men. Weak leadership was only part of Baghdad's crisis. Corruption and conspicuous excess among the city's elite alienated artisans, merchants, and the urban poor. A weakened currency and soaring food prices triggered unrest, while unpaid soldiers drifted into banditry or simply deserted. Years of natural disasters compounded the strain. Heavy rains, violent storms, and seasonal flooding eroded infrastructure and morale. In 1256, the Tigris overflowed its banks for more than a month, sweeping away much of the lower city. Contemporaries read the calamity as a sign of divine displeasure with the decadent al-Mustasim, and for decades it was remembered as the Mustasimid flood. As Mongol armies closed in, pestilence spread through the capital, killing hundreds, perhaps thousands. The Caliph's position was precarious. Probably in late 1255, Hülegü sent a message to Caliph al-Mustasim, demanding, as he had from other rulers in the region, that Baghdad provide troops for the campaign against the Nizari Ismailis. Al-Mustasim refused, because the Abbasids had sent tribute in previous years and were regarded as Mongol vassals. This refusal amounted to a declaration of independence. Part of Hülegü's commission was to test the sincerity of the Caliph's submission. Now he had his casus belli. From the Mongol perspective, the Caliph was in open revolt. The war that followed was not aimed at Islam as a faith. Had the Mongols seized the Pope and judged him a rebel, his fate would likely have been similar. What mattered was submission to a universal order they believed heaven had mandated. Refusal to submit was the highest blasphemy. After Alamut fell in December 1256, Hülegü lingered near the still-defiant Nizari fortress of Lamasar, then wintered at Qazwin, just south of Alamut, until March 1257. From there he embarked on what looks at first glance like a circuit. Qazwin to Hamadan, on to Dinava, then Tabriz, back to Hamadan, back again to Tabriz, and a final return to Hamadan by September 1257, from which he would at last march on Baghdad. The itinerary had clear logic. First, Hülegü wanted to avoid a summer siege of Baghdad. Timing the approach for winter was prudent. Second, the delays gave his lieutenants time to secure adjacent theatres. Kitbuka Noyan, through force and negotiation, pacified Luristan and the Zagros passes, so the main host could move unimpeded when the campaign opened. In Anatolia, Baiju Noyan suppressed a Seljuk revolt at Aksaray in October 1256, then shifted east so he could advance on Baghdad from the west when called. Meanwhile, Hülegü and the Caliph traded increasingly sharp letters. Hülegü offered al-Mustasim another chance to submit, castigating him for refusing to aid the war against the Nizaris. The threat he sent, preserved by the Ilkhanid vizier Rashid al-Din, ran as follows. Previously we have given you advice, but now we say you should avoid our wrath and vengeance. Do not try to overreach yourself or accomplish the impossible, for you will only succeed in harming yourself. The past is over. Destroy your ramparts, fill in your moats, turn the kingdom over to your son, and come to us. If you do not wish to come, send all three, the Vizier, Al-Alqami, Sulayman Shah, and the Dawatdar, that they may convey our message word for word. If our command is obeyed, it will not be necessary for us to wreak vengeance, and you may retain your lands, army, and subjects. If you do not heed our advice and dispute with us, line up your soldiers and get ready for the field of battle, for we have our loins girded for battle with you, and are standing at the ready. When I lead my troops in wrath against Baghdad, even if you hide in the sky or in the earth, I shall bring you down from the turning celestial sphere. I shall pull you up like a lion. I shall not leave one person alive in your realm, and I shall put your city and country to the torch. If you desire to have mercy on your ancient family's heads, heed my advice. If you do not, let us see what God's will is. Al-Mustasim rejected Hülegü's terms outright. When Hülegü's envoys were turned back at Baghdad, crowds harassed them so violently that the Caliph's vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, had to dispatch soldiers to escort them out before they were killed. Word of the incident reached Hülegü, alongside an official reply that sneered at him as a young, inexperienced upstart. A curious jab, since Al-Mustasim was only 4 years Hülegü's senior. Hülegü mocked the Caliph's incompetence and, on reading the message, flew into a rage. As preserved by Rashid al-Din, his answer was blunt. God the Eternal elevated Genghis Khan and his progeny and gave us all the face of the earth from east to west. Anyone whose heart and tongue are straight with us in submission retains his kingdom, property, women, children, and life. He who contemplates otherwise will not live to enjoy them. Love of status and property, conceit and pride in transitory fortune have so seduced you that even the words of your well-wishers have no effect on you. Your ear cannot hear the advice of the compassionate, and you have deviated from the path of your fathers and forebears. You must get ready for battle, for I am coming to Baghdad with an army as numerous as ants and locusts. Be the turning of the celestial sphere how it may, the power to command is God's. Ibn al-Alqami immediately grasped the scale of the danger and urged appeasement. His reputation in the sources splits sharply. In some Mamluk narratives, the Shia vizier appears as a conspirator, colluding with Hülegü to topple the head of Sunni Islam. In Persian and Il-Khanid accounts he is the sober voice, trying to steer the Caliph away from catastrophe and to save as many lives as possible. On this last exchange, Ibn al-Alqami briefly convinced al-Mustasim to send rich gifts in hopes of diffusing the crisis, only for the Caliph to be talked out of it by the Dawatdar, Mujahid al-Din Aybek, the regime's senior military official, and a hardline advocate of resistance. Abandoning the costly offerings, al-Mustasim sent the following message to his vizier, meant to calm his fears. Do not fear the future, and do not talk fables, for there is friendship and unity, not enmity and hostility, between me and Hülegü and Hülegü Khan. Since I am their friend, they are of course friendly and benevolent toward me. The envoy's message is false. Even if these brothers contemplate opposition to or treachery against me, what has the Abbasid dynasty to fear, when the monarchs of the face of the earth stand as our army and obey our every command? If I request an army from every country and mount to repulse the foe, I can incite Iran and Turan against these brothers. Be of stout heart and do not fear the threats of the Mongols. For although they are powerful upstarts, they pose nothing but an empty threat to the House of Abbas. If Rashid al-Din's account of the exchange is reliable, it makes plain how badly al-Mustasim misread the moment. In his next letter, he invoked earlier monarchs who had attacked the Abbasids and, he claimed, suffered divine punishment, citing especially Muhammad's second Khwarazm Shah, whose abortive march on Baghdad in 1217 was followed not long after by the devastating onslaught of Hülegü's grandfather, Genghis Khan. Hülegü answered with another threat, vowing to drag the Caliph down miserably into the jaws of a lion, and ended the parley. Before moving, Hülegü consulted the astrologers and diviners of his retinue. Their omens were uniformly grim, warnings of failure, catastrophe, and death should he harm the Caliph. He then turned to the scholar he had rescued from the Nizari fortresses, Nasir al-Din Tusi. After a moment's thought, Tusi told him none of those disasters would occur. Hülegü Khan will take the Caliph's place, he said. That was enough. With the frontier passes secured, the march on Baghdad began. As Hülegü advanced through Kermanshah, massacres followed in his wake. The invasion converged on the city along 3 axes. Kitbuka moved through Luristan to approach from the south. Baiju Noyan crossed the Tigris near Erbil to close from the west and north, and Hülegü led the main host through the Hulwan Pass to seal the eastern approaches, completing the encirclement. Across Mesopotamia, towns and cities opened their gates. In January 1258, as the noose tightened, the Caliphal field army under the Dawatar tried to throw back Baiju's column. Lured into a feigned retreat, they were driven toward a breached dike. Floodwaters inundated their camp, and only a few survivors straggled back to Baghdad. By January 22nd, the Mongol forces had linked up around the capital. The besieging host included not only Mongols, but also subject Iranians, Turks, Georgians, and Armenians, together with roughly 1,000 Chinese siege specialists. The defenders were badly outnumbered and had little prospect of relief. For a week, the attackers methodically prepared their lines. Pontoon bridges were thrown across the Tigris, hung with nets and iron hooks to prevent escape, either upriver or down. Lacking local stone, they hauled in ammunition for the engines. A deep ditch was cut around the outer approaches, the spoil piled into a rampart with gated entries. Mantlets and protective housings went up over the artillery. In classic Toluid fashion, the city was sealed, and its fate effectively fixed. The main assault opened on January 29th. A relentless storm of stones and arrows drove the defenders from the parapets. Baghdad's wall artillery, poorly maintained, poorly sighted and outranged, proved, in one source's blunt phrasing, useless. Under rolling mantlets and other wooden shelters, Mongol sappers and archers crept to the base of the fortifications, sending shafts deep into the city. One arrow loosed from the siege lines pierced a palace window and killed one of the Caliph's daughters, a tragedy that spread panic through the court. Missives were tied to arrow shafts and shot over the walls, promising mercy to those who did not resist. By early February, towers and bastions had begun to crumble under constant bombardment. On February 3rd, Mongol contingents seized segments of the curtain wall. When a senior Mongol commander was killed by an arrow from the city, his enraged subordinates pressed the assault still harder. Only then did al-Mustasim grasp the scale of his error. He dispatched envoys, including the previously bellicose Dawatar, to parley with Hülegü. They were executed on arrival. Nothing short of the Caliph's unconditional submission would suffice. On February 10th, al-Mustasim and his family emerged from Baghdad and placed themselves in Hülegü's hands. At first, the Caliph was treated with formal courtesy. Other notables followed to submit, and many ordinary townspeople fled the pestilence that had already claimed thousands within the gates. Those who came out found themselves trapped between the city walls and the Mongol lines. Once the garrison had surrendered its arms, the sack began on February 13th. Popular memory cast the fall of Baghdad as anarchic slaughter and total annihilation. The reality was more chilling, organised, methodical, and still catastrophically violent. The city was not erased so much as dismantled in a controlled fashion. A valuable window onto the process comes from the musician Saif al-Din Urmawi, preserved by the Mamluk writer Shihab al-Din al-Umari. In Urmawi's telling, commanders received specific quarters of the city and fixed periods, 1 to 3 days scaled by rank, to gather plunder. Urmawi's own neighbourhood was assigned to Baiju Noyan and a chosen retinue, not an entire army division. Meeting Baiju with gifts, he hosted a feast, played for his guest and won his favour. Baiju pressed him to perform for Hülegü himself. Before the walls, Hülegü enjoyed the concert, ordered Urmawi's quarter, placed under guard and spared from looting, and even granted him gardens that had belonged to the Caliph. Within that grim calculus of conquest, the sack of Baghdad proceeded exactly as intended. Multiple sources report that certain segments of Baghdad's population received formal protection during the sack. Christians, especially Nestorian clergy, Shiites and Alids, Khorasan merchants, Qadis, scholars, sheikhs, and, in at least one account, Jews. Individuals are described as petitioning Hülegü to spare specific homes, almost certainly for substantial payments, which implies a level of discipline among the looting troops. They had to record addresses and respect exemptions. Even the familiar claim that the Tigris ran black with the ink of Baghdad's libraries deserves caution. Nasir al-Din Tusi personally removed many books to Maraga, where he later established his observatory, and several chronicles suggest the looting lasted roughly a week, not an entire month. Selective clemency did not extend to most residents. For every walled quarter like Urmoz that was safeguarded, many more were gutted. Treasures accumulated over 5 centuries were carried off, and signature Abbasid monuments were stripped or torn down. Hülegü entered the city on February 15th and compelled al-Mustasim to reveal his hidden hoards. A grim tally, 12,000 severed ears, was presented as a measure of the slain. Corpses choked the streets. Within days, the heat and stench forced Hülegü to halt the sack on February 20th. The city was not left to brigandage. A governor and Mongol officials were appointed, and Ibn al-Alqami retained his post as vizier to supervise the removal of bodies and the first steps of civic restoration. On February 20th, Hülegü withdrew to the village of Waqaf to escape the foul air, where he reportedly fell ill. There he ordered al-Mustasim's execution, most commonly described as the Caliph being wrapped in a carpet and trampled, an oft-cited method to avoid spilling royal blood. His family was put to death soon after. European accounts offered a different epitaph, that Hülegü locked the Caliph in his treasury and left him to starve, an ironic ending for a ruler widely faulted for failing to fund troops and defences. So ended the 500-year-old Abbasid Caliphate. The impact on Islam is hard to understate. Since the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, there had been a widely recognised successor to him in the form of the Caliphs, Rashidun, Umayyad, and Abbasid. Most Muslims saw him as the spiritual, if not the actual political head of Islam. For the Caliphate, seemingly inviolable and permanent, to come to such a violent and sudden end sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world. Caliphates had been overthrown before. Previous dynasties like the Buyids and Seljuks had held the caliphs as puppets and militarily defeated them, while the Nizari assassins had claimed the lives of at least 2. But never before had the Caliphate actually been erased from existence by a power claiming universal sovereignty in its place. Distant relations of al-Mustasim were eventually set up in Mamluk Cairo as new caliphs, but were never widely recognised. The Ottoman sultans would also claim the title of caliph in time, but none have ever been able to step into the position held by the Abbasids. It's no surprise that many Muslims throughout the following centuries have referred to the sack of Baghdad as a scar of the psyche of the Ummah, one which it has not recovered from today. With the fall of Baghdad, Hülegü could now cast his eyes onto Syria, down the Levantine coast to the newly established Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The sense was real that Hülegü was about to bring the whole of Islam under the authority of the House of Genghis. Our next episode takes us to the Mongol drive to the Mediterranean and the famous clash of Ain Jalut, an episode you won't want to miss. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the history of the Mongols. If you are enjoying the series and want to help support it, you could like the video, make sure you are subscribed to the YouTube channel, and leave a comment to let me know where in the world you are listening from. Thank you, and see you all next time.